We've a wonderful assortment of dances in today's concert, and it's worth reminding ourselves today of just how various dance music can be. Sometimes you can get the impression, listening today, that almost all dance music is in a very regular, almost mechanical 4 beats to a bar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, and so on like that. But the very different kinds of rhythms and colours and qualities that you'll find in the dance music today. And it's also a reminder too that people dance for so many different reasons. They can dance when they're, to use an old-fashioned word, courting, whether they're planning a relationship on a very long term or on a very short term. You can also dance as a magical incantation, whether for good or evil, or in praise of God. You can dance to purge the system of something. You may know the legend that the tarantella, the Italian dance, was danced apparently to get rid of or neutralize the effect of the poison of tarantula bites. Or you can dance too, as in some kinds of Spanish music, to purge the soul of dark emotions. Or you can just dance for joy, which is perhaps one of the best reasons for doing it of all. Several of the dance pieces in this concert are based on the waltz. That great Viennese dance, that emblem of elegance and sophistication and the glamour of Imperial Vienna. It was born, indeed, in Vienna in the late 18th century, and it was born of a kind of marriage between the courtly minuet, very stately, very gracious dance, and a much more earthy kind of dance that they dance in the country in Austria called the Ländler, which has a very emphatic... Imagine a bit of wild yodeling going with that, and I think you'll get the picture. And it was the coming together of those two that made the waltz, this dance in 3-time. Nevertheless, there's also something very characteristic about the way particularly Viennese musicians play the waltz rhythm. There's a sort of little tilt, a push, a sort of swoon on the first beat. As the man swings the woman around in his arms, a reminder that actually this was a dance of seduction in its early days and was denounced as such from pulpits all over the UK in its time, before it became an embodiment of something very different indeed. Richard Strauss's Rosenkavalier waltzes celebrate the great height of Imperial Vienna and the waltz. In fact, slightly anachronistic here because the opera is set in the early 18th century before the waltz was actually invented, but it doesn't matter. It embodies, I think, for many of us, the image of the luxury and enjoyment of life that was associated also, as well as the formality, with Imperial Vienna. But then later on, we have another kind of take on the waltz, Maurice Ravel's La Valse, which is much more the music of a horrified onlooker from another country watching the collapse of the great Habsburg Empire in the 20th century, the collapse that led very quickly to the outbreak of World War I. There's a terrific sense of unease in Ravel's La Valse. It's very exciting. It's a very gripping piece of music, but at the same time, you suggest that something very, very dark and unpleasant is happening here too. But there's also the sweetly inflected slow waltz of Dvořák, Czech composer, who brings something, well, folkish to the quality of the waltz too. This isn't as much Vienna as maybe Prague, a different kind of city and a different kind of feeling. And then also we have Prokofiev's waltz, known as Happiness, from his lovely ballet Cinderella. This is a much more Russian kind of waltz. It's in the minor key. Russians love minor keys. And it's full of dark energies too. You'll notice the way Prokofiev uses the tuba with great enthusiasm near in the beginning of this piece. But it's also uplifting, a reminder too that music that seems on the surface dark can also be a very positive experience too. Between all this, we have the magic and mystery of Spanish dance music. Granados' Goyescas, of course, were inspired partly by the works of the painter, the great Spanish painter Goya, who wasn't afraid of confronting the dark side of life himself. And then there's Manuel de Falla in the music from his ballet, The Three-Cornered Hat. Falla had a marvellous feel for the native styles of Spain, which are so rich and various, so full of exciting colours and rhythms. Many of you will know the habanera rhythm, for instance, famous from Carmen's habanera. There's also a device you'll hear with the title hemiola, which sounds like a blood disease, but actually it's really an interesting way of breaking up counting three. So you can either go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And sometimes you can put the two on top of each other, which makes very exciting cross rhythms too. You'll hear that in some of the Spanish music here, and also in the music of the Mexican composer Márquez in his Danzón. It's all a reminder that that Latin culture from Spain bears an interesting aftertrace of the time when Spain belonged to the Middle East and Ottoman Empire, which had all kinds of musical and rhythmic and modal riches of its own. And that's left its stamp on Spanish music. But one of the reasons that's made it so different from the folk music and folk dance music of so much of the rest of Europe. Finally, let's come to our own Malcolm Arnold. I don't know how many of you heard the recent prom in which his Fifth Symphony was performed with huge success. But it does seem to be dawning on many people at last that Malcolm Arnold was a very fine composer indeed. He can be as dark and tortured and wild as Russia's Shostakovich. Sometimes some of Malcolm Arnold's later music does reflect the mental ordeal that he suffered. He suffered from some form of possibly bipolar disorder himself, and which were made worse by various traumas and the rather primitive kinds of treatment that were inflicted on him when he was a young man. And yet also, like Shostakovich, Arnold could write gloriously entertaining music. In fact, he was a bit of a genius at it. You may not think you know this piece, English Dances, set number 2, but I guarantee that it'll hardly be a few seconds into it before I think something very familiar will be arising for most of you at least. All I can say, I think, in the end is enjoy. You're certainly